Hey folks, Matthew Weiss here, WeissAdvice.com and Weiss Advice here on YouTube. In this video, I'm going to be comparing four, what I would describe as intelligent equalizers. There isn't necessarily a word for this category of EQ, so I'm going to make it up, but you'll see the commonality here once I name the products if you're familiar with them. So the first one is going to be the Sonible SmartEQ3. The second will be the Oeksound Soothe2. The third is going to be the Soundtheory Gullfoss EQ. The fourth is going to be the Baby Audio Smooth Operator. And if you're familiar with any of these, you know that they're capable of calculating a lot of detail in terms of the source material and then reacting dynamically to it. It's a lot more intricate and reactive than a typical dynamic EQ. So I have a vocal here that is pretty tricky. It's for a mix that I'm actually currently doing for a client. And the difficulty here is that it's a comped set of takes where there's different styles of delivery, different vocal tones, and also different mic proximities, which is creating a pretty wide array of tone curves. And then in addition to that, there's also a lot of interesting, weird moving resonances that are activating at times that seem to be present sometimes and don't seem to be present in other times. I'm just going to play it and you're going to get what I mean here. So let's listen to the first couple of bars. In the first one, you're going to hear a very bass-oriented tone, like it's under a blanket, and then immediately following that, you're going to hear it shift to a very thin and upper mid-range strident tone.
Yo, Milwaukee, born and raised, my peoples, they know. Us young cats that hit capital like muscle shows. I can't stop believing my journey of bobbing and
Like literally the first two lines sound like completely different tone-wise.
Yo, Milwaukee, born and raised, my peoples, they know. Us young cats that hit capital like muscle shows. I can't stop.
And then, to make it more complicated, as we get halfway through the verse, it then switches over to a third tone, which is a little bit more low-mid oriented.
But we ain't no babies, no Johnny-come-latelys, ever since the early 80s, purely from Hades, Laverne Shirley with the rabies, some dogs must have
Now, tone-wise, this would be my favorite tone out of everything we just heard, except if we listen again carefully, we'll also notice that this is where those resonances I mentioned start to get really problematic. So listen to the word we, and you'll hear a whistle tone show up in the upper mids, and then lately you'll hear a pung noise show up somewhere in like the low mids, center mids, maybe like 500 to 800 kind of range.
But we ain't no babies, no Johnny-come-latelys, ever since.
All right, and I'm going to loop them up so that we hear them nice and clearly. I'll start with the little, like, weird, pungy mid-range tone.
Come-latelys, 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 come-lately.
Yeah, whoop, whoop, whoop kind of thing. And then before that, on the word we.
No baby. But we ain't no babies, no Johnny.
Yeah, there we go.
But we ain't, 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 but we ain't.
I'm not good at whistling.
But we ain't, 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 but we ain't.
All right, so we've got a lot of those dancing resonances all over the place. Okay, how do we deal with this? Well, we could try some insane dynamic EQ configuration trying to solve all problems at once. I'm going to tell you right now, this doesn't sound good. I'm going to play it for you, but it's pretty embarrassing. Here's our before.
But we ain't no babies, no Johnny-come-latelys, ever since the early 80s, purely from Hades, Laverne Shirley with the. But we ain't no babies, no Johnny-come-latelys, ever since the early 80s, purely from Hades, Laverne Shirley with the rabies, some dogs must have mauled somebody.
And what doesn't sound good about it, like, there's something that should immediately just feel really not so great about it. Like, the tone does balance itself, but there's almost this weird, like, vacuum effect that feels like the voice is being sucked into something and getting really grainy.
But we ain't no babies, no Johnny-come-latelys, ever since the early 80s, purely from Hades, Laverne.
And this is distortion that's happening from phase shift. All the transients of the vocal, there's tons of group time delay, there's a lot of moving phase shift, which causes like this kind of flangey, smeary sort of thing to happen with comb filtering, and it just sounds a mess. So it's like we've solved some problems, but we've made a lot of problems a lot worse. So I'm going to pop on over to the SmartEQ3. So the intention of the SmartEQ3 is to give you a kind of blueprint for a sound, in this case, vocal low, and you record the vocal that you begin with, and it creates a yield function. It goes, this is what we think a low vocal should probably sound like. Let's yield what you started with to that. So it gives you what, in theory, should be a really good starting point. Maybe. if it works. And then you get a little bit more fine control over here. So I'm using the dynamic function so that it is constantly readjusting. I've also put in a couple of my own bands just to sort of tighten things up. And then I've also put in a band limitation right here to stop the stuff that's over maybe about 11K, something like that. And then also getting rid of the stuff that's under 100 Hertz because that's not really relevant to a vocal. If it's not like we're going to need a whole bunch of 50 Hertz because there was not a lot of 50 Hertz there or something like that. It's a vocal. And lastly, because this is a very, very complicated EQ curve, I'm going to use linear phase mode. Linear phase mode does not mean artifact free, it just means artifact consistent. And consistent artifacts usually better than inconsistent artifacts. So let's do a quick little before and after and see if we have made things better.
But we ain't no babies, no Johnny-come-latelys. Ever since the early 80s, purely from Hades. Laverne and Shirley with the rabies. Some dogs must have mauled some of y'all. But we ain't no babies, no Johnny-come-latelys. Ever since the early 80s, purely from Hades. Laverne and Shirley with the rabies. Some dogs must have mauled some of y'all taking bites.
I have to say, I think that's pretty darn good, actually. That feels pretty smooth. It balances things pretty well. This first line feels a little thin to me.
But we ain't no babies, no Johnny-come-latelys. Ever since the early 80s.
But once we get into this second part over here going forward, it feels really well balanced overall.
Johnny-come-latelys, ever since the early 80s, purely from Hades. Laverne and Shirley with the rabies. Some dogs must have mauled some.
So in terms of tone balancing, I think this is doing a fantastic job. Not perfect. I think that we would maybe need to do a little bit of automation maybe on this first line. And it's not really getting rid of those like very specific resonances. It does soften them a little bit. It makes them a little better, but
Come latelys, 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 come latelys.
It's still there. It's just not as annoying. So we've improved all around. I think this is a great starting place, actually, to really do this correctly. Now, next one I'm going to pull up here is going to be Oeksound Soothe. I feel like Soothe gets compared to the other three, especially to the Gullfoss EQ quite a bit, but Soothe, in my opinion, is completely different than the other three. The intention for this is to target specific resonances that might be moving around. First of all, right off the bat, I'm not going to be using this correctly, and that's going to paint a bit of an unfair picture of Soothe2. Just need to put that disclaimer in there. I don't think Soothe2 functions best when you're using it broadband. The speed constants that you need to target things that are in the higher frequencies are inherently different than the speed constants that you need in the low frequencies. And so I would not do this in one plugin. If I was targeting my upper mid-range, trying to soften things, and I was trying to also get rid of some room modes, which is what I think is happening in the mids, I would use probably two separate instances of Soothe2. That said, we're going to try it with one. So here's our little weird pung noise that comes up on the word lately and various other places. And then this is just our upper mid smoothering that we're going to try and do here. Before then after.
But we ain't no babies, no Johnny-come-latelys. Ever since the early 80s, purely from Hades. Laverne and Shirley with the rabies. Some dogs must have mauled some. But we ain't no babies, no Johnny-come-latelys. Ever since the early 80s, purely from Hades. Laverne and Shirley with the rabies. Some dogs must have mauled some of y'all taking bites.
So you can hear that it does actually effectively smooth things out, especially when we get past the first little bit, once we get over to maybe around here.
From Hades, Laverne and Shirley with the rabies. Some dogs must have mauled some of y'all taking bites.
Yeah, that series of lines right there, I'll play without it.
With the rabies, some dogs must have mauled some of y'all taking bites while brewing for ratings.
Then with
the rabies, some dogs must have mauled some of y'all taking bites while brewing for ratings.
That's definitely noticeably smoother. What I will say is I'm not using this to the best effect that I can because I'm trying to do everything at once. The other thing is that you're not going to tone balance your signal. I'm not, there's clearly too much lows and low mids in this vocal right now. I'm not going to correct that using Soothe. That's not what Soothe is intended for. Lastly, I want to point something out about Soothe which can really throw people off. Soothe is a very, very strong processor. You can really go overboard very easily with it. Even just in terms of the default positions, I don't necessarily like it. I almost never use it in default. I'll show you how easily it is to make something that sounds terrible. Watch what happens if I just click into hard mode.
With the rabies, some dogs must have mauled some of y'all taking bites while brewing for ratings.
That's horrible sounding. This is awful. All right. Back to soft mode. Another way we can really screw up the sound very easily, turning the sharpness too high.
But we ain't no babies, no Johnny-come-latelys, ever since the early 80s.
Not good. Another way that's a little sneakier, this fast release mode, I don't care for it. I think that it works better in the upper mids where the waveforms are actually moving faster, but once you get into the low mids, it immediately is a recipe for intermodulation distortion. So you'll notice that my release is turned up to 5 here, which is halfway up, but I think that's actually in a lot of ways a better starting place for Soothe 2.
But we ain't no babies, no Johnny-come-latelys, ever since the early 80s, purely from Hades, Laverne and Shirley with the rabies. Some dogs must have mauled some of y'all taking bites while brewing for ratings.
Now, I'm saying all that I'm not trying to be disrespectful to the people who made Soothe 2 or to the product. I think it is actually really a very good product. I just want to be critical in a way that's informative to say that it is very easy to overdo it and there is a learning curve. So to get the most out of it, you really do need to take the time to learn how to use it in the best way. All right. Let's move on to the Gullfoss EQ. The Gullfoss EQ is kind of like SmartEQ3 meets Soothe meets all the other ones. Like, it's kind of doing a lot of stuff, and the thought process behind it is really entirely different. First of all, this again is going to be a little bit unfair to the Gullfoss EQ because it's really primarily meant for overall mixes. Very complex source material. It's not really intended for individual tracks unless you're doing something very specific. But that said, I do want to show what we can do with it. So let's do a quick little before and after, and then I'll kind of go through the settings.
But we ain't no babies, no Johnny-come-latelys, ever since the early 80s, purely from Hades, Laverne and Shirley with the rabies. Some dogs must have mauled some of y'all taking. But we ain't no babies, no Johnny-come-latelys, ever since the early 80s, purely from Hades, Laverne and Shirley with the rabies. Some dogs must have mauled some of y'all taking bites while brewing for ratings.
So this is kind of the same and different as SmartEQ. SmartEQ is attempting to create the most balanced version of the sound, whereas Gullfoss is attempting to make the fullest, best representation of the sound. And those are not really exactly the same thing. They're similar but different. And so if we compare them directly, you'll notice that SmartEQ3 is a little bit more balanced and smooth sounding, whereas Gullfoss is going to be fuller sounding, but perhaps not as balanced.
But we ain't no babies, no Johnny-come-latelys, ever since the early 80s, purely from Hades, Laverne and Shirley with the rabies.
SmartEQ3, here's Gullfoss.
But we ain't no babies, no Johnny-come-latelys, ever since the early 80s, purely from Hades, Laverne and Shirley with the rabies. Some dogs must have mauled some of y'all taking.
It's almost giving us a little bit of a pink noises kind of curve, which is not really exactly appropriate for vocals. So putting that out there to begin with. Now, the other thing with the Gullfoss is it's got a bit of a learning curve as well. Maybe not quite as challenging as Soothe, but it's definitely done in a way that doesn't quite... You need to experiment with it first. So all of these controls, let's just reset them real quick here. Recover, tame, bias, brighten, you got to get used to them a little bit. So the recover control is going to analyze anytime there's presence of frequency content, it's going to look for places where there are dips in the frequency curve. So let's say you've got a solid amount of 2K and a solid amount of 2.5K, but you have like a weird dip at like 2.2. It's going to see that, and recover is actually going to boost it. It's going to fill in that hole. Whereas tame is kind of going to do the opposite. It's going to look for wherever the standard of energy is, and if there's a specific band that feels like it's dramatically above that, like it's coming in too hot, like, you know, we've got a reasonable amount of 2.5K and we've got a reasonable amount of 3.5K, but then there's just a spike at 3K, it's going to tame that down. So the two of them kind of work together to to fill in the holes and to also smooth out the spikes and bring it down to a more neutral level. Because of this, it doesn't exactly do things the way you would necessarily expect. So you would think that the way, for example, you would want to tame down a whistle tone would be with tame, right? You're taming it down. But you really kind of need to do both, because a whistle tone means a concentration of energy into a specific resonance while there is a dip of energy around it. It's a focusing of energy into one narrow spot. And so recover can actually make the whistle tone feel less offensive by filling in the areas around it. Okay, so more practically, how do we use it? Well, I would start by just turning the recover up and then just going as far as you feel works.
Ever since the early 80s, purely from Hades, Laverne and Shirley with the rabies. Some dogs must have mauled some of y'all taking bites while brewing for ratings. Going crazy, pay miss, delay. My wife said I'm always...
Yeah, I feel like I can get pretty high. I'm going to take the lows out. We don't really need all that. I feel like I can push this pretty high, and it actually makes the vocal a lot better. I've gone well into like where I'm hearing FFT artifacts, but it just shows that I'm pushing recover up, and it's not exciting frequencies in a way that's creating harshness. It's actually doing the opposite. It is reducing harshness.
Ever since the early 80s, purely from Hades, Laverne Shirley with the rabies. Some dogs must have mauled some of y'all taking bites while brewing for ratings. Going crazy, pay Mr. Lane. My wife said I'm...
And then right after that, I would go right over to tame, and I would start doing the exact same thing.
Ever since the early 80s, purely from Hades, Laverne Shirley with the rabies. Some dogs must have mauled some of y'all taking bites while brewing for ratings.
You can hear that FFT grain starting to show up, right? We've definitely gone too far here.
Ever since the early 80s, purely from Hades, Laverne Shirley with the rabies. Some dogs must have mauled some of y'all taking bites while brewing for ratings. Going crazy, pay Mr. Lane. My wife said I'm always deep.
So this bias control now is going to fine-tune whether or not this is working more toward recovery or tame. And this is, again, one of those things where I would just turn it in one direction and see if it improves, or turn it in the other direction and see if it doesn't.
Ever since the early 80s, purely from Hades, Laverne Shirley with the rabies. Some dogs must have mauled some of y'all taking bites while brewing for ratings.
So I think as we start to shift toward recovery mode, we get something that's a little bit smoother. So...
Ever since the early 80s, purely from Hades, Laverne Shirley with the rabies. Some dogs must have mauled some of y'all taking bites while brewing for ratings. Ever since the early 80s, purely from Hades, Laverne Shirley with the rabies. Some dogs must have mauled some of y'all taking bites while brewing for ratings.
Not bad. And then we do the same thing with Brighton. Brighton is going to then compensate with some top-end type of excitement or boost.
Ever since the early 80s, purely from Hades, Laverne Shirley with the rabies. Some dogs must have mauled some of y'all taking bites while brewing for ratings. Going crazy, pay Mr. Lane. My wife...
So I think to get a neutral sound, I actually want to de-brighten it, actually. I want to darken it up a little bit. I feel like it excites the upper mids a little too much when I start pushing it toward a brighter sound. But now I'm going to kind of compensate with this boost control. And this boost control, also very different than a regular boost control. So learning curve here for sure. But the boost control is going to be Fletcher-Munson curve dependent, meaning it is not going to boost linearly. It is going to boost with the up. It's going to boost the lows proportionately more than it's going to boost the upper mids. I'm just going to start turning it up and you'll hear what I mean.
Ever since the early 80s, purely from Hades, Laverne Shirley with the rabies. Some dogs must have mauled some of y'all taking bites while brewing for ratings.
And likewise, if I go in the other direction, it's going to start stressing the upper mids.
Ever since the early 80s, purely from Hades, Laverne Shirley with the rabies. Some dogs must have mauled some of y'all taking bites while brewing for ratings.
So these two, the brighten and the boost control, actually kind of work together in conjunction. So what I'm thinking is maybe I'll actually brighten the signal a little bit, but I'll also turn up the boost a little bit.
Ever since the early 80s, purely from Hades, Laverne Shirley with the rabies. Some dogs must have mauled some of y'all taking bites while...
Or maybe go the opposite direction. Let's darken it a bit, and then let's cut down on the Fletcher-Munson boost.
Ever since the early 80s, purely from Hades, Laverne Shirley with the rabies. Some dogs must have mauled some of y'all taking bites while brewing for ratings. Going crazy, pay Mr. Lane. Ever since the early 80s, purely from Hades, Laverne Shirley with the rabies. Some dogs must have mauled some of y'all taking bites while brewing for ratings.
So I think that this doesn't give us as much of a finished result on a single vocal that as maybe like, say, SmartEQ3. I think it gives us a fuller representation and maybe creates a better potential starting place, but definitely not something that's closer to being a finished place. And I would say for this, I do prefer the SmartEQ3 overall. I think I would feel differently if I was testing this out on Mixbus, where we have the entire record coming together, which is really what the Gullfoss was originally designed for. Okay. Lastly, the smooth operator. So smooth operator is kind of like it's like a version of the Gullfoss EQ that is a little bit less specific. So you can't necessarily start bringing up little dips. It's kind of like giving us a broad version of Soothe, like a broad banded version of Soothe, or it's giving us a more dynamic version of SmartEQ3. I guess would be the best way to put it. So let's just do the before and after and then work it out.
Ever since the early 80s, purely from Hades, Laverne Shirley with the rabies. Some dogs must have mauled some of y'all taking bites while brewing for ratings. Ever since the early 80s, purely from Hades, Laverne Shirley with the rabies. Some dogs must have mauled some of y'all taking bites while brewing for ratings. Going crazy, pay Mr. Lane.
So kind of like the SmartEQ3, I feel like it's not doing a ton for the actual resonances, but it is generally balancing the tone curve a little bit better. Generally balancing the tone curve pretty well. So one more time, before and after.
But we ain't no babies, no Johnny-come-latelys. Ever since the early 80s, purely from Hades. Laverne Shirley with the rabies. Some dogs must have mauled. But we ain't no babies, no Johnny-come-latelys. Ever since the early 80s, purely from Hades. Laverne Shirley with the rabies. Some dogs must have mauled somebody.
So gives us a very, very consistent sound in the vocal, which I like quite a bit. Doesn't really help all of those annoying resonances. So I'm going to go through them all one at a time here, starting from nothing and then doing SmartEQ, Soothe, Gullfoss, Smooth Operator. Here we go.
But we ain't no babies, no Johnny-come-latelys. Ever since the early 80s, purely from Hades. Laverne Shirley with the... But we ain't no babies, no Johnny-come-latelys. Ever since the early 80s, purely from Hades. Laverne Shirley with the... But we ain't no babies, no Johnny-come-latelys. Ever since the early 80s, purely from Hades. Laverne Shirley with the... But we ain't no babies, no Johnny-come-latelys. Ever since the early 80s, purely from Hades. Laverne Shirley with the rabies. But we ain't no babies, no Johnny-come-latelys. Ever since the early 80s, purely from Hades. Laverne Shirley with the rabies. Some dogs must have mauled.
Okay, so what's my overall verdict on this particular shootout? Well, my real verdict here is it's not really a good shootout. that the worst one is me. Because they're not all really being used in their intended purposes here. But in general, I think that the one that is doing the best job as in terms of getting us close to a finished product is the SmartEQ3. I think it's arguable that the second one might be the Gullfoss because it's giving us a slightly fuller sound. I do detect a little bit more artifact in there. But I think I would be happy with either. I think they're both giving me something I can very easily work with. Smooth is doing something it's not really intended to do. Smooth would have to be used in conjunction with then another EQ to create the correct tone curve completely. So maybe I would do something like use Soothe and then also use the hoser, taking down some of those low tones and maybe taking out some of those like stuffy mid-range tones.
But we ain't no babies, no Johnny-come-latelys. Ever since the early 80s, purely from Hades. Laverne Shirley with the rabies. Some dogs must have mauled.
So something more like that. I think that Smooth Operator is a decent compromise between what the SmartEQ3 and the Gullfoss is doing, but quite frankly, I don't think that it's really living up to either of them in this particular case. With that said, I really don't want you to take this out of context and to think that Smooth Operator is somehow inferior to either of those. It's not. I actually use it quite a bit and really like it. It's just not as useful when you have so many very specific narrow moving resonances, and I think that's where it's not performing quite as well. So, okay, how do we reconcile this all together? Well, there is an actual way to accomplish this goal. When you have remarkably different tone curves to different lines, I would treat them as different vocals entirely. So I might grab my bassiest stuff that happens in the beginning and move it to its own track. And then the upper mid-rangey stuff that happens here, I would keep it on its own track. And then the stuff that starts to get more into the low mids, I would move that onto its own track. And I would process all of these a little differently because they're all completely different tone curves, right? So this is really the better way to go about it, starting from something that is on separate tracks. Then what I would do is I would create an aux. So I'm going to grab this. I'm going to create a submix. And I'm going to assign the bus here. I don't know, let's do 22, whatever. And let's send these off to 22. So now I have these all coming to my lead Vox right here. So here is where I would do the processing that I would want to be homogeneous on everything. So maybe something like Soothe might go here so that everything that Soothe needs to be doing happens on this track. And I would probably not worry about the upper mids from Soothe. I would really just focus on that one annoying resonance and get Smooth to work that way if I needed to save time. But I'm going to give you the real answer. Help.
But we ain't no babies, no Johnny-come-latelys.
Okay, the real way I would do it is I would take destructive editing. I would grab my fab filter or something like that. Probably not fab filter specifically because I don't think that it performs the best for this.
come latelys, 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 come latelys.
And every time I hear one of those resonances,
no Johnny come latelys, ever since the early 80s, purely from
all right, I'm going to highlight it, and I'm going to destructively edit it out.
the early 80s, purely from Hades, Laverna 80s, purely from Hades, Laverna Shirley with the rabies, some dog Laverna from Hades, Laverna Shirley with the rabies, some dogs must have mauled some of y'all rabies, some dogs Shirley with the rabies, some dogs must have mauled some of y'all taking bites.
All right, I'll stop there. I mean, this is getting pretty repetitive, but this is really the way to do it if you have the time. And you know, I think this is going to be a good note to sort of end off on, and that is that when it comes to mixing records, people want to know what's the secret, what's the magic that makes a really, really great mix. And the answer to that is there isn't a secret. There isn't a magic trick. It comes down to really two things: identifying what you need to hear and doing the work to get the goals that you want. Really, to sum it up, it's actually the magic secret trick. It's really boring. It's hard work. It's going through and killing each one of those stupid resonances instead of trying to rely on something else to do the work for you. So overall, I think that all of these products are great products in and of their own rights. I'm really interested in the Gullfoss EQ. I'm pretty new to using it, and I really like what it can do. SmartEQ3 I've been using for a long time. I love it. Smooth operator, when I need it, I use it. Soothe is probably the one that I use the least, but when I need it, it's pretty important to have it because it's very specific to how it can accomplish certain goals that would be tremendously difficult to do going through every single resonance that needed to be removed and all that kind of stuff. They all have their own purpose, so it really just depends on what you're trying to do with it. And I think that's a good place to just cap the video off here. So if you dig this video, hit that like button. If you want to catch more videos like this, hit subscribe with the bell notifications so you get notified. And lastly, you know what we say here at Weiss Advice: we are musicians, sound is our instrument, and I will catch you next time.